Good evening, and thank you all very much for being here. Firstly, I want to say thank you to the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens for the opportunity to reside here as a research fellow. I've got to pay my dues, and also for offering me so much support, including accommodation here, which is one of the most amazing spaces a little girl from Sydney could have imagined to stay in while living in Athens. I'm sure it's a bit orange outside, but the view is incredible, both left and right sides. I want to say thank you also for helping me, especially to Stavros and Liga, for navigating Greece's labyrinthine immigration system. That's been a real treat. A bit louder. I haven't given a lecture in 2 years, so I might have to lubricate several times throughout. And I also want to say thank you to everyone for checking in on me to make sure that I'm alive, given it's been the final year of my PhD. And a special thanks to Tamar for offering unwavering support of my project, even though we only just met, and for helping me to identify future postdoctoral opportunities. So as Tamar said, this paper is an abridged version of a major chapter in my dissertation that explores the function and symbolism of guard dogs in classical Athens. The wider scope of my thesis looks at several different functions of dogs within specific socio-historical contexts. I look at guard dogs, dogs in war, dogs as commodities and consumable items, as companions, and their role in the philosophical discourses. Thank you. You all get a bit steamy. You can look as sweaty as I do in front of you all right now. So the goal of my thesis has been to show that looking at human and dog interactions at particular moments in history can build on our knowledge of that time. My aim today is to give a very small overview of one of those key relationships, that of Athenians and their guard dogs, and to give an example of how this particular function can add nuance to our thinking about Athenian comedy and its political undertones. So with that, let's see if the computer works. Okay. The political climate in the United States since 2016 has been rather turbulent and sometimes pretty funny. Looking ahead to the election in November shows us two very familiar faces. One of those faces is known to love dogs, owns 2 of them, and is often photographed patting puppies. The other is thought to hate dogs, is one of 3 presidents in US history to not have owned a dog or have kept a pet in the White House, and he also has a long track record of calling people he dislikes dogs, mad dogs, rabid dogs, bad dogs, lazy dogs, and sick puppies. The list goes on. So negative has Trump's relationship with dogs, both real and figurative, been that political commentators have begged the question, does Donald Trump like dogs? And if not, what might that mean for who he is as a person? And what's more, what might that mean for the state of our democracy? The fact that dogs might be discussed as a window into his psychology and questioned as a key indicator of his politics is not entirely a new socio-political phenomenon. Rather, I propose that we can observe a similar phenomenon in classical Athenian political discourse, particularly in the representation of Cleon of Athens in the comedies of Aristophanes. Dogs aside, before, during, and after Trump's presidency, political commentators, historians, and public figures have pointed out numerous parallels between his political style and that of Cleon. Both men were loud and gregarious public speakers who shirked established ways of politics. Both were technically upper class and very wealthy, but appealed most to the everyday people. Both men have also been described as masters of populism, who trafficked heavily in anger and stoked the instinctual and visceral emotions of the demos, their fear, their anger, and their resentment. Some historians have even claimed that among the pantheon of demagogues and dictators of the classical world, few have offered a more tempting comparison with the 45th president than Cleon. Indeed, notable ancient historians such as Barry Strauss have described Cleon as a sort of proto-Trump, a leader who Strauss said, and I quote, was one of unrestrained vulgarity and crassness, who attacked Athens' elites and intellectuals while the crowd cheered, an ancient lesson for the future of the American legal and democratic systems. Even today's popular culture has remembered Cleon as the undesirable and corrupt populist aftermath of Pericles' untimely death. In the video game, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Cleon the Everyman was a primary antagonist who cultivated an image of the common citizen to hide his corruption while yelling in the assembly, decrying the elite, and urging the people to make Athens great again. When Cleon is killed in the game, there's cutscene, and his soul travels into the underworld and is greeted by its guard dogs along with Cerberus. You can see him just here. And they drag him behind the realm's gates. While this might seem like an innocuous or an irrelevant part of a video game, I'm going to show you that parallels between Cleon, guard dogs, and Cerberus were key to criticisms of his politics and personal character in Athenian comedy. I like it when technology still works. It's a bit worried. So while it might not seem that Trump likes dogs all that much, classical writers and modern historians have agreed that Cleon promoted himself as the watchdog of the people, the Kion tu Demu. When Cleon called himself the people's watchdog, it promoted the efforts made to improve the lives of everyday and commercial class members of the demos. But this guard dog was flipped on its head and ridiculed by the elites in reaction to his dogged pursuit of them in the courts, and because they believed he was using his position to manipulate the people for his own continued gain. It's usually me. This was no protector who barked on the people's behalf, they said. This was a self-interested and manipulative dog who cultivated a facade of protection to conceal his own desire for power and empire over democracy. But sadly, most of our evidence for Cleon's biography comes from elite ancient sources that don't like him at all. For example, in his version of the Mytilenean debate, Thucydides called him the most violent among the Athenian citizens, but also the most powerful and persuasive with the demos. With Pericles now dead from the Athenian plague, Cleon rose as the new archetype of a phase of politicians that Thucydides described as men with private ambitions and interests in matters apparently quite foreign to the war, who led people into projects that were both unjust to themselves and to their allies. This was an upstart politician who did not come from the established elite, who challenged the systems and morals of democracy and popularized aggressive Athenian imperialism over their allies. A century later, Aristotle claimed that Cleon corrupted the Athenians more than anyone else, with violent public outbursts and loud screeching in the assembly. Because he dominated arenas dedicated to public speech and debate, he was able to capture the attention and stoke the emotions of the everyday people. But his most outspoken critic was Aristophanes, who dedicated no less than 4 plays, the Acharnians, Knights, Wasps, and Peace, to directly caricaturing Cleon as a low-class, rough public speaker who riled up the people just to increase his own political clout and power, and who, by monopolizing the courts, stacking juries, and prosecuting his enemies, managed to grind Greece into a fine powder. Back in 1962, Anthony Andrews argued that men like Cleon were symptomatic of Athens' hegemony and her coffers expanding. Governance required commercial men with fiscal and administrative expertise. But these men didn't do politics the usual way. They didn't seek out political friendships or alliances, but instead they courted the people's favor, showing them that Athens needed them as competent financial men. By contrast, Aristophanes used his comedies to make fun of a specific set of policies that Cleon promoted, such as increasing the tribute that allies paid to Athens, which effectively turned them into subjects more than allies, and most notably, increasing the daily wage of Athenian jurors from 2 to 3 obols, which was about a third of the average labourer's daily wage. The Athenian court system initially had juries comprised of hundreds of citizen volunteers, and the original institution of their pay was to ensure that poorer citizens had opportunities to participate and wouldn't be locked out because they needed to work. While 3 obols might not seem like much, to older citizens unable to work as much or to participate in the military, it would have been both a way to earn some money and to feel like they were still participating in democracy. However, Cleon's supposed increase of this pay has long been one of the more controversial facets of his political career. Our sources believe that he used the courts to buy support from jurors, who began to regard him as a sort of patron because he was seen to have been the one to increase the pay and Athens' treasury, which then in turn kept the pay at the increased rate. Aristophanes basically says as much in Wasps, line 113, when a chorus of elderly jurors brag that we are resourceful in making a living too, because we sting everybody, so to provide our daily pay. So in this way, the courts come across as a sort of proxy for Cleon's political power. But because our ancient sources' criticisms of him are so detailed in their negativity, we also get to catch a glimpse of what he did and what his appeal was. As I hope to be able to show you, these come out strongly through the motif of the guard dog. Aristophanes frequently alluded to and even transformed Cleon into a guard dog character in plays held at the Dionysia that Cleon himself would have attended, sat front row at, and watched, as his guard dog persona was lampooned as a smokescreen for alleged politicking, bribery, and corruption. But one question that has bothered me is if the guard dog was already an established part of Cleon's popular appeal, how was Aristophanes able to invert it as a foil for his own propaganda? I believe the answer lies in how guard dogs were conceptualized more broadly as having a twofold meaning of both loyalty and deception. So before we get into the duality of the guard dog in comedy and politics, we should have a look at what sorts of guard dogs were part of that Athenian imagination. Various types of dogs could and did guard property, animals, and people. But the dog most often associated with this function in the scholarship was a large and muscular specimen called the molossus, who was thought to have originated in Epirus and was closely associated with the Molossi tribe. In Aristophanes' Thesmophoria Zeusai, a female character lamented that the Athenian men were going to the theatre and they were watching tragedies featuring murderous and unfaithful women like Medea and Clytemnestra. They would then come home paranoid, and they would search frantically around the house for hidden lovers, install locks and bolts to confine their wives at home, and would purchase molossus hounds as bogies for our lovers. By parodying the extents that men might go to avoid cuckolding, Aristophanes provides us a glimpse into Athenian society, where the molossus guard dog was an epitome of their protection and was specifically bred and purchased to guard. This was even supported later by Aristotle, who described the molossus as superior in protecting and herding sheep because of its pertinacity and courage in facing wild animals. So protective dogs were often called phylakes, guards and watchers, but ancient descriptions of guard dogs did not always specify regional types like the molossus, but instead described them through key descriptors such as their sharp teeth, their loud and brassy barks, and their instinctive ferocity. In Xenophon's Economicus, he said that dogs were good to use for keeping away wild animals, from harming the crops and cattle, and for providing safety and comfort in the solitude. So in this way, we can see guard dogs not only offering protection, but also companionship to farmers and shepherds who lived in and transported flocks across regional and isolated spaces in Greece. Dogs were also represented on funerary statues to provide protection in death. From the second half of the 5th century to the end of the 4th century BCE, there was an upsurge in canine funerary images in Athens, such as this mid-4th century marble dog, which you can find at the Keremikos site and museum. This dog was one of 2 that was constructed as an acrotarian. My apologies for the really tiny font. I'll remember that for next time. Acrotarians were roof ornaments, and they were placed on either end of the enclosure of a funerary site. So during this particular period, Athenian necropolises were changing, and paraboloi, or funerary structures like these, were becoming more and more popular with elites who were using their distinct familial funerary sites to highlight their lineage, unity, and legitimacy. So in this way, dog statues like these were as much status symbols and protectors of the family's bond as they were statuary guardians of burial sites. The dog's protective functions also had significance for the cult of Asclepius and healing. Pausanias mentioned that there were several regional tales for the life of Asclepius, and one from Epidavros involved him being exposed by his mother and suckled by a goat who was protected by the flock's watchdog. Moreover, again, really tiny font, I apologise immensely, but miraculous healing tales, also called Iamata, inscribed at the Asclepian and Epidavros, included 2 rituals where the sanctuary's dogs were also used for their healing properties. One licked the eyes of a boy and restored his sight, while another licked and cured a growth on the neck of another boy. I don't know if many of you have dogs, but they tend to be attracted to particularly stinky or moist things on the human body, and their saliva does have some level of antiseptic property. So it's interesting that we have it here inscribed from antiquity as well. So there are many more examples that I could give you of guard dogs in everyday life, but I'm hoping that this small cross-section can give us a little bit of a sense of the scope of dogs providing protection at the home, in the city and on the farm, and at specific sites. It's one thing to own a guard dog. You also need to ensure it remains loyal to you and make sure it gets the job done. This was not lost on our ancient sources. In Hesiod's Works and Days, he advised that farmers feed their guard dogs with the sharp teeth so they would guard their property from thieves at night. Several Aesopic fables featured guard dogs who protected sheep, cattle, and poultry from predators, namely wolves, but they also focus on the circumstances that caused them to abandon their duties and follow their wilder, less domesticated, but ultimately free canine instinct. For example, a stingy farmer kept a guard dog to guard his flocks, but gobbled up all the food himself and didn't feed him properly. So the dog conspired with a wolf to steal a lamb and sneak into the pantry so they might eat better. Another farmer was trapped in the countryside during the winter and had to eat his farm animals. When his guard dogs saw this, they realized they would be next, and subsequently plotted their escape. The possibility that a dog might disregard man was at the core of another tale, where a pack of wolves approached some guard dogs and remarked that they found it ridiculous that these dogs would look after flocks owned by men who put collars around their necks, beat them, and fed them only scraps. Educational stories like these highlight that proper care and adequate food were crucial to maintaining a productive and sustainable relationship between man and guard. Indeed, for all the emphasis on taking care of your guard dog, the flip side was that they might still turn on you. And Greek literature is filled with stories involving real and imaginary dogs behaving badly. Of these, the most famously naughty guard dog was, of course, Cerberus. Hesiod described Cerberus's guarding style as that of a cruel trick. The many-headed dog, would lure souls into the underworld by fawning over them as he wagged his tail and flattened his ears. Once he had drawn them in through a false sense of security, Cerberus then quickly changed and turned on them, watching them closely and devouring anyone who tried to leave. Guard dogs like him unlocked a latent fear that dogs might turn, evoked as early in the Iliad by Priam, who worried that his own guard dogs that he had reared and fed at his table might devour his corpse when he died. Tried to capture that there, not so well. In the Odyssey, Penelope's suitors declared that the shepherd Eumaeus will be torn apart and devoured by his own guard dogs. In Athenian drama, literal and metaphoric guard dogs were common motifs and bringers of death, vengeance, and madness, which were also used to mediate themes of loyalty and deception. In just one example, in Aeschylus's Agamemnon, the guard dog was routinely referred to through the standard references to its sharp teeth, keen eyesight, and sense of smell, but it was also used metaphorically to allude to betrayal in the family. For example, Clytemnestra proclaimed herself as having been the most faithful watchdog of the household, while Agamemnon was away at Troy. And there she is there, naughty girl. While secretly she had taken a lover and was plotting Agamemnon's murder. Cassandra, however, saw through the canine veil and described her as deceiving Agamemnon like a hateful dog who licks him and fawns over him, stretching her ears joyfully. If we think back to Hesiod's description of Cerberus's fawning trickery, then this inversion of Clytemnestra the guard dog reiterates the same fear of protection being used as a veil for deception. So what we've seen so far is that our sources refer to guard dogs through a specific set of physical characteristics and functions, but the evidence also shows that there was more to it than just outlining the sorts of work that they did. They also indicate a subtext in which dogs enlisted to protect might, and sometimes did, betray people, and this veil of protection made their deception even more shocking. With this in mind, we can now apply the idea of the dualistic guard dog to contexts of political marketing and reception, where a politician who might promote themselves as the watchdog of the demos could be satirized or accused of using his position to mislead and exploit those same people he sought to protect. Mentions of guard dogs in comedy capitalized on the latent fear that dogs might betray their masters. Cleon was the primary recipient of comedic representations of guard dogs turning bad. But what exactly he did to justify the critique and lampooning of his guard dog moniker is an area of inquiry that my research is one of the first to cover in depth, and hopefully today I can provide you with a brief snapshot of what I mean. Just as Thucydides and Aristotle described Cleon's rough and uncouth speech as having an undue influence over the people, so too did Aristophanes describe his speech as a type of a croaking, a croissant, a term that also connotes the baying that dogs make when they're trying to alert humans. This was not a style of speech that was popular with the traditional rhetors and conservative politicians, but of the commercial class. Cleon typifies this in that he did not have an ancient or elite ancestry or military experience. Before his rise in 429 BCE, the traditional leaders of Athens had been the strategoi, the military generals whose wartime expertise preempted and justified their right to civic leadership. By contrast, Cleon came from a working class background. His family are thought to have made their money in leather tanning, which Aristophanes mocked relentlessly because it was a dirty and stinky working class trade. This less civilized background was best embodied in his loud and unbecoming style of public speaking, which earned him the epithet of the shouter. Hurling insults, shouting, and talking over other men in the assembly were not the elite methods, but they were effective with the public. They were so effective that in Aristophanes' Nights, the chorus told the lowborn sausage seller that his inferior birth was actually a good thing for his political career, now that Athenian leadership was no longer for the educated and good man, but the ignorant and the disgusting. They told him that he had everything a good demagogue needed, a voice that was miaros, it was bloody and polluted, a low birth and an education obtained in the agora. But for Cleon, this loud bark was presented as necessary to voicing the concerns of the everyday people and making sure they were heard. Also, a side note, I was just telling Tamar, I dabbled in AI art for this, and I'm very proud of it. Thank you, thank you. Okay. While our only evidence for the things that Cleon said and did come from largely hostile sources, they all discouragingly acknowledge that he had a lot of influence. In the Nights, the primary antagonist was a character named Paphlagon, a slave who came from a tanning background, as did Cleon, and who controlled another character aptly named Demos, by persuading and tricking him and rewarding him with little gifts he had stolen from other people. This Paphlagon Cleon deceived, blackmailed, claimed credit for others' work, and gaslit the gullible and greedy Demos by presenting himself as his indispensable guard dog. In one scene, Paphlagon recalls an oracle to Demos that said, "Take care of your sacred dog with the sharp teeth, who barks and shouts for you, because he provides your income, which if he cannot do, he will be killed. For a swarm of jays squawk against him in their hatred." For Paphlagon, it is he, or rather Cleon, who barks. The guard dog with the sharp teeth who must be protected just like those described by Hesiod. This dog barks to ensure that the Demos were paid, even though he was surrounded by enemies who sought his death. We know that Cleon's foreign policies with the allies were aggressive and often unpopular with the elites, but they generated more profit in the tribute and fattened the treasury's coffers, which were popular with the people. His domestic agenda in the courts kept the jurors paid, and their watchdog ensured there were prosecutions to be heard. There is a lot of scholarly debate about whether or not the juror pay came out from the tribute income or the domestic revenue, but the general scholarly consensus is that this distinction would not have mattered so much to the people, and Cleon probably promoted the idea that the tribute funded juror pay, so the Demos would continue to support his career and his military exploits. Evidently, juror service kept him popular, but there was a growing concern that this gave him too much influence over the people and therefore too much power. The potential monopolization of institutions by demagogues and the lower classes they proclaim to represent can also be seen in the same oracle scene. The sausage seller rejects Paphlagon's oracle interpretation and instead provides his own version that doesn't deny that Paphlagon was the watchdog, but that he was a far more sinister sort. He says, "This dog is a Cerberus, a slave dealer, who wags his tail fawningly at you while you're eating, but he is watching you and waiting to gobble up your meal when you look away. At night, he often goes into your kitchen unnoticed, and like a true dog, he licks clean your plates." There's a lot going on in this interpretation of the oracle. The dog Cleon was not simply self-serving. He was a veiled Cerberus, who cozies up to his master when he wants something, but he'll take what he wants when his master is distracted. If we compare it to Paphlagon's interpretation, this version draws out the irony of the dog's protection and reveals it for its hypocritical deceptions, only worthy of the original mythological deceiving guard. The Nights was performed in 424 BCE, just 1 year after Cleon had returned from Pylos, with almost 300 enslaved Spartan hostages. So it seems clear why Aristophanes would call him a slave dealer. It's also known that at this time the elites were convinced that Cleon had stolen the glory at Pylos from the more seasoned and competent strategos Demosthenes, not the Demosthenes, but another one. and it was after Pylos that Cleon announced that jury pay would increase. So there's a lot of contextually relevant symbolism happening here. But the watchfulness of the dog, waiting for his master to leave, also alluded to Cleon's use of spies and informants to uncover alleged oligarchic conspiracies and fiscal mismanagement. Moreover, Hesiod had described Cerberus as having 50 heads and a brassy voice, while the chorus in the Wasps described sharp-toothed Cleon's monstrous ego as being surrounded by 100 flatterers who lathered him in praise. This imagery must have resonated with Athenian audiences because Aristophanes repeated it again in the piece, even though Cleon had been dead for a year by that time. It seems then that the fear was of a Cleon 2.0, bearing all the hallmarks of the Benorzic class demagogues, who would again deceive the people into supporting their policies by giving them little tastes of victory and then lapping up their praise. But comparisons to Cerberus in comedy were very particular to Cleon, with even the Scholia on Aristophanes' piece referring to a fragment from the comedian Plato, not the Plato, comedian Plato, who had also called Cleon a Cerberus. These consistent intertextual parallels not only invite laughter, but indicate that inferences of his double motives were linked to an implicit cultural understanding of the double-sided nature both of Cerberus and Watchdogs in general. Kenneth Reckford, a scholar of Aristophanes, described allusions between Cleon and dogs as being a satirical commonplace in Athenian political life, rather like today's political cartoons. And I believe the same can be said for the recurrent parallels between Cleon and Cerberus. More AI art, so you can all appreciate. So outside of illusions, the guard dog motif became an actual character in the Wasps. I've just mentioned that there was a character named Keon, modelled after Cleon. The Wasps focuses on satirising the courts and the people who had become addicted to jury service, which we know Cleon was very involved in. In this satire, the Athenian general Laches and Cleon were transformed into the dogs Labes and Keon. Part of the play has them set up in a mock trial by the character Cleon, which is a not so subtle name meaning he who hates Cleon. Cleon is trying to help his father, named Philocleon. No explanation needed. And the old man is addicted to jury duty, and he waits in line all day, hoping his lot will be picked. In the trial, the dog Keon accused Labes of gorging himself on all the Sicilian cheese available and not sharing any with him. Now, there are some very interesting contextual themes going on, as Cleon and Laches in real life were not on good terms and had very different policies concerning Athens' presence in Sicily. And it was thought that Cleon had wanted to bring a case against Laches because of his generalship in Sicily, but I'm not going to go further into that. Suffice it to say, they had beef, and it would have been relevant to the audience. Now, the Cleon advocates on behalf of Labes, saying that he was the best of their dogs, capable of protecting the whole flock, and who fought for his owner and guarded the doors. Because Labes was out of the city and in the fields protecting the sheep, he was hungry. He didn't have access to the high-quality food available in surpluses in the city. By contrast, the dog Keon only guarded the house, never leaving, and yet always yapping and demanding food, and biting those that denied him. Obviously, we've got a pretty clear juxtaposition going on between the good guard dog, labouring abroad, and the domestic guard dog, staying at home, yapping and feasting. Aristophanes is thus contrasting two politicians' very divergent political careers in order to parody Cleon. Laches puts his military skills to use, while Cleon, known for having a very limited military experience, is focusing on the city and being jealous when the glory wasn't shared. For Cleon, sharing was not caring, and his guard dog character was often linked to food. In the nights, as we saw, Cerberus oracle claimed that Cleon would sneak little morsels of others' snacks. This can also be seen in the accusation that Cleon would demand food and bite those that wouldn't feed him. I think these probably refer to the fact that Cleon was honoured by the Demos with a reward of a lifetime of free meals paid by the domestic treasury in the Prytaneum. This was in reward for his role in Athens' victory against Sparta at Pylos, and we already know that many believed he stole Demosthenes' thunder on this. I believe clearly that the goal was to show that Cleon was literally and metaphorically power-hungry. For my part, the watchdog motif in Aristophatic comedy was a foil for Cleon's political subterfuge. Its bark riled and persuaded the gullible and the money-hungry people. Its watchful gaze sought conspiracy amongst its opponents, and its loyalty was conditional to its own gain. Let us not forget that Cleon would have been in the audience for most of these plays, and I'm sure we could speculate about how the dog parodies might have been laughed hysterically at or awkwardly giggled at by the mix of Badelocleans and Philocleans in the audience. Just as Aristophanes distorted Cleon's watchdog image to play on its duplicity, around a century later, a Hellenistic speech loosely attributed to Demosthenes also invoked the guard dog motif against Aristogiton. Not much is known about Aristogiton outside of these speeches, but it's generally thought that he was in a huge amount of debt and he loved going to court. The speech argued that while Aristogiton's friends might have called him their Kion to Demo, he was really a pretend guardian who did nothing to protect them from the predators, but was actually one himself, who then feasted on the sheep under his protection. The dog's bite refers to Aristogiton's litigiousness because it's believed he originally taken other political figures, orators, and even family members to court, but he had since moved to prosecuting the people he had proclaimed to advocate for, including private individuals and workers such as coppersmiths and tanners, or he blackmailed them with the threat of prosecution. The speech presents the people's watchdog as being the disguise of a man who turned on the people who had long supported him. It becomes clear that the sheep Demosthenes referred to were those among the jurors who watched as he prosecuted their own class. He even stated there was an old aphorism that claimed that dogs who have tasted mutton should be cut to pieces. Evidently, you can't trust a guard dog that has sampled the goods they should protect. Like Aristophanes' parodies of Cleon, the speech reversed Aristogiton's watchdog image as the facade of a greedy manipulator whose unmasking would free the demos from further exploitation and embarrassment. To wrap up, I've sought to show that the guard dog had a twofold meaning by presenting some of the evidence for guard dogs and weaving them into examples of the watchdog demagogue character that featured in Athenian socio-political discourses. My contention is that the watchdog had clear socio-political currency and was grounded in cultural and mythical conceptualizations of guard dog behaviours. Allusions to guard dogs shed light on what these demagogues were doing, while at the same time referencing the understanding that dogs could turn on humans. This fear was evident in the literature involving real and figurative guard dogs as tricksters and unfaithful servants. Cleon the dog and his loud, greedy, and dubious behaviours were particularly singled out as emblematic of his brand of politics and the negative impacts they were thought to have on the demos. Repeated canine references, metaphors, and even a zoomorphic lawsuit signified that Cleon marketed himself as the people's watchdog and was parodied for it. Guard dogs were well-developed motifs that negotiated divergent perspectives on the uses and abuses of democratic institutions and political influence. Vivid descriptions of barking referenced shifts in the style and reception of political rhetoric in a context where post-Periclean politicians had shirked traditional modes for loud but popular speeches. While this barking may have represented the demagogue's advocacy for the less elite citizenry, it was mocked for its coarseness and doggish style. Representations of loyal guard dogs protecting houses, people, flocks, and incomes spoke to the ongoing need to provide and safeguard civic institutions such as jury pay, but these were likewise inverted to produce more sinister and deceptive realities, where dogs fawned, flattered, and seemed to protect, but only did so to ensure their next meal. The watchdog Demagogues character was further embodied in the original mythical guard dog Cerberus, whose success at guarding the underworld relied on his ability to deceive. Finally, cultivating a reputation as the dog of the demos could be an attractive piece of propaganda that purported to safeguard the people's sovereignty and grow their fiscal welfare. By contrast, if an individual's policy ambitions and influence were unpopular with certain groups, the guard dog motif provided critics with opportunities to warp their public image by claiming corruption, bribery, and hypocrisy. These different interpretations demonstrate that dual motifs with the watchdog negotiated political divides concerning the function and morality of Athenian democracy, the uses and misuses of its institution, and the nature of individual power, duty, and influence.